Now listen to this. But even as a sinner, man was in a different position from that of Satan. Lucifer in heaven had sinned in the light of God's glory. To him, as to no other created being, was given a revelation of God's love. Understanding the character of God, knowing his goodness, Satan chose to follow his own selfish, independent will. This choice was final. Pause. Why was this choice final? Was it because God was unwilling to forgive Satan? Is that why? God wouldn't forgive him?
No.
There was no additional light.
Was it because justice required sin be punished, that Satan had to be punished, he had to be held accountable? Was it because Jesus was unwilling to pay the legal penalty for Satan? He wouldn't die for Satan. Jesus wouldn't give his life for him.
No.
It's what Romans describes as the wrath of God, which just turns...
So somebody was about to say it. Go ahead and say it now.
There was no additional light or truth that could be shown to him
So
to reach him. He had seen the full unveiled glory.
let's put the pieces together. What is biblical definition of sin? Sin is
Lawlessness.
lawlessness, transgression of the law. And what is the law?
Law of love.
The law of love, right? The law of love, that's right. And what is life built or constructed upon?
Law of love.
So when you transgress the law, you take yourself, and where's its source? Where's the source of all this?
God.
In God, that's right. So Satan came to believe God himself to be untrustworthy after having seen the foolish revelation of God's true character of love that any created being had ever seen in all universal history. He rejects God's character of love, says God is not like this. There was no more truth that he hadn't already processed and rejected left to be presented to him to dispel the lies now operating inside him. There's nothing more God could do to reach him. And thus, I'm continuing with the quote now. Oh, in fact, I want to tell you a story before I continue with the quote. Russell can testify to this because he was there. 6 years ago, Russell, I, and one other person, maybe you all remember Jim Luke, used to live around here and part of our class at that time. We all were in a meeting with some of the pastors over here in one of the local churches. And one of the pastors had concerns, and he said, you know, one of my concerns about your ministry, Tim, is that I'm afraid that what you teach leads people out of the church. And I didn't get offended. I said, you know what? That's a very fair concern. You have a hypothesis. You have a concern. Are you willing to test your hypothesis against the evidence? Now, unbeknownst to me, Jim and Russell had a history that I didn't fully understand. And Jim pipes up and says, you know, I was raised in the Adventist church. I went to Adventist schools. I used to be an Adventist pastor, and I became disillusioned. I left the church. I left my ministry, left the church, doing business, worldly things. Somebody brought me to Tim's class. I'm back in the church now. And Russell,
Same story,
raised in the church, left church, back in the church now after coming to the class and hearing this message. So here, they both told their testimony to this pastor. And I said, you've got two people that just gave a testimony, evidence that in fact the class has brought people back to the church. I said, I can let you talk to my entire class membership. When I'm not even in the room, you can test your hypothesis against the evidence and then come to your own conclusion. Are you willing to do that? He said, no, I just believe you lead people out of the church. That was it. It's a true story. Russell was there. What do you do when you're dealing with a mind who refuses to look at the evidence? This is what's happening here. This is what was Satan's position. He had shut his mind. He concluded that there's no truth there, that's not right, and there's nothing more that can be done to reach until the mind changes. So continuing on with the quote, there was no more God could do to save him, save Satan. But man was deceived. His mind was darkened by Satan's sophistry. The height and the depth of the love of God he did not know. So right now, pause. How is man in sin, his position, different than the position of Satan in sin? What's the big difference?
Satan did know the height and depth of God's love.
So what was not available to reach Satan? What was no longer available to reach Satan?
Any new light.
Any new light, a revelation to dispel light, because he'd already rejected the light, and there was no more new light. He's already settled on light. But man, even though they're in rebellion against God, didn't fully understand the truth about God's character. There's much, much more truth and revelation about God's character that can dispel the lies that Adam and Eve believed and win them back to trust.